Hello, and welcome to the Nurturing Resilience podcast, where me, your host, Lesha Nelson, weaves together the worlds of somatics, science, and energetics to nurture a deeper connection to yourself. This is a podcast that covers a span of topics and ideas, from guest storytelling their rites of passage that catalyzed their resiliency, to nervous system and mind-body health education, to deep contemplation on topics such as cultivating connection to ourselves and others in a complex world. I'm an occupational therapist, somatic practitioner, and body worker, attachment specialist, and baby whisperer, with over 20 years of experience with mind-body connection and supporting matrescence. What you're receiving today and listening today is the uncut version of my podcast. This is where I interview guests and I don't do any editing. You're getting it all in the raw. If you're interested in my podcast, you can find that on Spotify, which is the edited version. And if you're interested in my work, you can follow me on Instagram at Lesha Nilsson and also through my website at leshanilsson.com. If you enjoy what you hear today, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it on your social media pages with your friends, your family, your loved ones. Let the world know that it's here. If you really like it, you can follow me and write a review. That's how my podcast gets out to listeners like you. And this important information about the body, somatics, and nervous system can find more people that need it. All right, thanks so much, and let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. This is Nurturing Resilience, and I am your host, Lesha Nilsson. And today I am so excited to introduce our guest, Lara Parry. Lara is a licensed clinical social worker practicing since 2009 and the clinical director of Roots and Branches Wellness. Lara founded Roots and Branches because she wanted to help people practice self-compassion and understanding that there is no shame in whatever you are struggling with. She seeks to help others find their voice and feel empowered to make changes in their lives by understanding their past. Lara is passionate about helping expecting parents understand mental health during pregnancy and postpartum phases of their lives, and she has made this a core pillar of their practice. Lara graduated with a Bachelor of Social Work from Brigham Young University and continued to get her Master's of Social Work from the University of Utah. Her training includes emotionally focused therapy for couples, Gottman theory, PMHC, which is basically certified in Parry mental health, clinical yoga practitioner for 500 hours, and internal family systems informed, and something else we're going to dive into called lifespan integration. Outside of the office, Lara practices in reading lots of books, writing poetry, and playing the piano. She enjoys moving her body by practicing yoga, traveling, and hiking with her husband and her 3 children. So I am so happy to have her on here today. And I found Lara because I was looking for someone that could come on the podcast and talk about internal family systems, put out a post into Facebook land, and she was recommended. And I decided to connect with her because she is local to Utah, where I am from, and because of her background in pre and peri mental health, which is obviously another huge passion of mine. So I thought this would be a really great conversation. And today's podcast won't be too much about like her specific story, which I get into sometimes, but more specifically around internal family systems, around something new that I'm excited to learn about, the lifespan integration, and as well as diving into pre and peri mental health. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So I don't know if a lot of people know what internal family systems is. And when you and I jumped on a quick phone call to invite you to the podcast, I didn't know actually that like the certification and the process and what's happening and like certified versus not certified. And so one, I would love to know like, what is internal family systems if no one has ever heard of this? Let's start there.
Okay, great. So I like to start by describing it like the movie Inside Out. Have you seen that movie?
Love
And
that
Inside
movie.
Out 2 is coming out, which I'm excited about. But it's a similar idea that we have different parts. Like we're not a mono mind, as they call it. Like we're not of one mind. We have different parts, almost like different personalities, but different kind of, they just call them parts. It's also called parts work, internal family system, same thing. Our different parts have different feelings, different motivations, different behaviors they want us to do. And understanding that by itself can be really helpful. But overarching all of that, we also have what's called capital S self, kind of our most Zen self, our most compassionate, calm, curious self. And when I found out about this theory, this idea, I just fell in love with it. It clicked with so many other things I've learned throughout my career, and I was really excited to dive into it more.
I have not heard of that concept of the self. I mean, it makes sense with this work is that there has to be like an overarching human that's working the whole system as a whole. And then within that self, we have many subparts that are, I call it driving the bus.
Yes, that's an excellent analogy.
So I think about it as like, there's me, there's the highest compassionate higher self, me. And I like to have that me driving my bus most of the time. But there are many times when like my 5-year-old or my 13-year-old likes to come in and take over and start driving the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And so if my 13-year-old is driving the bus, I might have some different reactions or some different responses than if my higher self, big self, was driving the bus. Does that kind of
Yes,
make
that
sense?
is such a great analogy. I also like to use like the CEO of the boardroom. Like we want our capital S self to kind of be in charge, but that's not really, it's not reasonable to say I'm always going to be my most Zen self, right? It's we learn how to have a new relationship with our parts when they do come up. So there are actually like three kind of main groups of parts that IFS talks about. So one of them is our manager group of parts. Um, these are our protectors. They want to protect us, help us avoid feeling pain or embarrassment or shame, and they want us to look good. So they attempt to help us keep control of the situation. Like that kind of a little bit of anxiety might be that voice, like, okay, like make sure you look good today before you go out, or make sure you get an A plus on your report card so everyone will think you're really smart, kind of like protecting us in that way, right? Some common like roles for managers are controller, striver, caretaker. Maybe they judge us a little bit. Um, can be self-critical sometimes. So our parts aren't always the kindest to us, but they always are trying to help us, if that makes sense. The book about parts theory, the most recent one is called No Bad Parts. So none of the parts are bad, right? A manager isn't bad, but it's trying to protect us.
I've never heard of the one called the straggler. What is the straggler?
So the striver. The striver is kind of that idea of like, I have to be the best, kind of this comparison, like self-esteem. If I strive to be the best, then no one will think bad of me. Then I'll avoid the pain of someone judging me, someone saying you don't look good or you're not good or whatever. So
Okay, that makes sense. So would someone like I have a tendency and I'm really working on healing my perfectionist tendencies.
mm-hmm.
Would the perfectionist be considered also like a manager?
Yes, definitely.
Because a perfectionist is like, in a way, it's trying to keep me from being hurt in some form.
Yeah. If
It's
I can just do it perfectly, I won't experience the pain of disappointing someone,
okay.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the big point of kind of the manager or the protector is like you said, they're really trying to help us not experience pain or something that might have happened in the past, but it also might actually be currently hurting us in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Our parts they don't always help us, but they think they're helping us, right? They think they're helping us, but sometimes they are causing us pain in the present. I'm sure, I mean, you probably had a turning point with your perfectionism where you were like, oh, actually, this isn't helping me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we don't want to like kick out that perfectionist part. IFS tells us this part of you isn't bad. We just want it to kind of do a different function for us. So right now, perfectionism might show up for a lot of us. It shows up, right? And it says like, here are the rules, and you have to do this, this, this. And we say like, oh, okay, perfectionism. Like, hello, I know you're showing up for me right now. I appreciate you're trying to help me. Is there something else you can do for me? Maybe you can help me think of how to connect with the person in this situation on a deeper level. Or maybe there's some other role you can do for me instead of like this critical self judgment. So that's one way to work with our parts, especially our manager parts.
Because they want a job. It sounds like they want a
Yes,
job.
they want a job so bad and they need a job. And we're not like, it's not realistic to say they're never going to show up in the, they're always going to show up. Our parts are not going to go away, but we can shift that relationship that we have with them.
Mm.
So managers, we all have a lot of managers. And sometimes though, we have painful experiences where we do feel that pain. Like we do feel the shame of, oh, I wasn't perfect. Or that person said something critical of me that really hurts. So we have another group of parts called firefighters. And the firefighters come in to put out the emotional fire that we've experienced, kind of in a more drastic way. They want to help us shut down the pain that we felt. So managers help us avoid it. Firefighters want to shut it down. They also protect our system, but they come in to like soothe us or distract us in a ways, again, that aren't always helpful. But at the time, our system is like, red alert. So firefighters come in sometimes with addictions, phone, shopping, whatever it may be, eating disorders, even suicidality and self-harm can be just firefighter parts being like, this is too painful. We've experienced too much pain for our system. And this part comes in as like, this is how we're going to numb this pain or avoid the pain.
So this might not make sense because I haven't studied the IFS theory, but it sounds really similar to when I've talked about in this podcast before. I talk about the nervous system a lot, and this sounds like someone who might be going into freeze or is starting to go into that freeze state. So they're in that like flat immobilization because we don't want to feel the things, and so we go into that very flat, disconnected, disassociated state. And so we might try to numb ourselves, like you said, through alcohol or food, or, I mean, I scroll on my phone. I like that's
We all do.
right.
Yeah.
And so is that the fire, like in this terms, that's the firefighter coming in and being like, nope, too much, time to disassociate, time to not feel this anymore.
Yes, exactly. So if we look at it like nervous system regulation, like the top tier, when like all systems go, that's when we're in like capital S self, when we're feeling good. When we move down to like the sympathetic nervous system, when we've had like a threat on some level, that's kind of when our managers take over and they kind of get mobilized for like fight or flight a little bit, like we're worried, right? Kind of in that middle zone. And then manager or firefighters are that bottom tier of shut down, withdraw, disassociate. So yeah, great comparison there.
Wow. Okay. So are those kind of the three main, is you got the self, the firefighters, and the managers? Or is there one more?
So there's one more group, and these are called exiles. And these are kind of like our inner children, like an inner child part that hold the pain from our past experiences. These are the ones that the managers and firefighters have built up to protect, are these little versions of ourselves. So they hold like shame, dependency, worthlessness, grief and loss, kind of those early things that we may have experienced. And these parts build up around them and they say like, that was too painful. Like we're never going back there again. So if I'm a perfectionist or if I have this skill of like binge eating, it's going to help us never feel that pain again. Right. So they build up to protect the exiles.
Okay. So can you give me an example? Well, I'm just wondering, like, I think you said our small part. So just trying to think of a everyday example. I often use my own my own life. People that listen to this podcast consistently know a lot about my life. um, but I'm just thinking like, so maybe like a current, actually something I'm working through right now is my 13-year-old self. That was a really rough time for me. Parents were getting divorced. I started going through puberty, like school changes, not a lot of support systems. Um, so I do think potentially a part of me exiled my 13-year-old because it's too painful to feel. Like my 13-year-old didn't have the tools or the capacity to feel the things that, or like she didn't know how to process what was
Mhm.
happening.
Yeah.
My adult self knows how to process those things. And so did I exile my 13-year-old self? And now my big self is coming online and starting to do some inner child healing. Because I do. I sit and work with her and we have conversations and I'm checking in on her and
Hmm.
allowing space for her to be seen and heard. Is she in exile? Is that how that works?
Yes, definitely. I don't know if it's really like all of your 13-year-old self, but definitely like during that time you had painful experiences, it sounds like that part of those emotions were kind of put like kind of stuck back there. Like when we have trauma, we say stuck, right? Like, um, so yeah, definitely with your 13-year-old self, there was some of that trauma that stayed there. Part of her was exiled during those painful experiences she had, I would say.
So in internal family systems and IFS, could I have multiple 13-year-old selves?
I don't know.
Like one is, like trauma, dealing with the trauma of what was going on with my life. But there was also like a very happy, like I was also a very happy 13-year-old too at times. And so,
Yeah. I mean, I would say, not being an expert in IFS per se, but I would say that definitely, I'm sure your 13-year-old self, yeah, she did have good times. She had moments of like capital S self energy, right? Where you had moments of feeling, good or connected with a friend or whoever. And so, yeah, you probably had moments of that. Like, I don't know if it would be considered different selves per se, but your 13-year-old, when you were 13, you had different parts even then, right?
hmm, good point.
Hmm.
Yeah. And the parts that got potentially exiled were likely the painful parts and the parts I didn't have capacity to work with or have help to work with
Yes,
at the time.
that's very well said. The part of you that felt overwhelmed with your parents' divorce or whatever it was, right? These parts of us that when we're young, we can't cope. So we have a manager that gets really, really steps in, is like, okay, well, I know how to solve this for you. And is trying to take care of us, right?
Okay, so to give our listeners more examples, my manager that stepped in that I'm working with is the one that always figures it out and works really hard. Like, as long as you
Yeah.
work hard and figure it out, then we're okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you work hard, you don't have to feel those feelings. That's
Right.
making tons of sense. So, when a client comes in, or if a client is interested in doing this kind of work with you, and I'm so fascinated about applying this to pregnancy and postpartum, but um, like, how does it kind of seem like a typical therapy session? Is it just more exploratory, and it comes up in different moments? Just as it comes up, you'll facilitate conversation, or how do you really work with this?
Yeah. So usually I spend the first few sessions kind of just like doing history and figuring out why the client's coming in and what's going on, do some education about IFS. And I really like it because it pulled from a lot of other things I'd already learned about that were very helpful and kind of gave it this great package of like, okay, here's how we implement all of this. Um, because I've been drawn to inner child work and just already like helping clients dialogue with their past selves and finding that helpful. Um, the work of Kristen Neff with self compassion was really big for me. And that's basically like the capital S self. is kind of that voice, that self-compassionate voice. So I'd already been doing that. And then, so I found this theory, which is really helpful. It helps us externalize what's going on. And so when we come in and we're like, I'm anxious or I am depressed, it's really healing to be able to say, okay, a part of me is anxious or a part of me is really depressed. But then just knowing, but I can, even if I can't really feel it right now, I know on some level I do have this other part of me I can learn to access that isn't depressed or that doesn't have to do all the things perfect, that type of thing. So we'll start to explore with parts, and usually in IFS language they call them trailheads. So a client will be like, hey, I felt really triggered by this thing. It made me really anxious. And that's like a little trailhead that we'll follow to figure out, okay, well, that's your manager. And how did it show up for you? If you were to describe it to me, what would it look like? And from there we go and kind of figure out, what were your early memories where this manager might have appeared, or why did it come up to protect you, and do that. So.
Wow. Do you find that most people are willing to dialogue with their parts, or are most people like, this is weird?
Most people love it once they get over that initial, it's weird, because it is weird. It is different. I'm asking them to have a conversation with themselves, which, is weird. But a lot of times I'll just say, hey, is it okay? I'm glad your skeptical part showed up. Is it okay if we ask skeptical part to wait in the waiting room while we just talk about this a little bit? And they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So most people love it. And it's really intuitive, usually once we get going.
Yeah, because it's really, I find when I'm dialoguing in cranial sacral, it's really patient led. Like they're
Yes.
doing the process and they're doing the work. I'm holding space, but it's coming from the client.
Mm-hmm. And it's so cool to see when they know the process and can come in and start just talking to their parts. Yeah, I'm here to witness it basically at that point. So it's very cool.
Yeah, and hold space for it, or help with the conversation if there's a stuck point. But it is very much client directed, which I just love.
Yes, and ties in really nicely with craniosacral because parts live in our bodies. And like that anxious part might be the tightness in our chest. And when we can link that and identify that, okay, that's my part showing up for me somatically, it makes the process easier. And it's this reassurance of like, oh, there's that part again. It doesn't have to be something like I freak out because I'm feeling tightness in my chest and I'm anxious. It's like, no, I just know that's my part showing up trying to protect me. So
Yeah, I really, really appreciate you saying that, because sometimes people are like, well, you want me to talk to my liver, or you want me to talk to my tight chest, or, but again, once they kind of get into it and start to recognize like, okay, this is more just maybe a potential pattern, or like you said, maybe it's a part that's showing up. And once we can facilitate conversation with that part, or body part even, or emotion, so much can shift.
mm-hmm.
2 questions for you. I just want to backtrack quickly. The skeptic, is the skeptic a manager?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then I asked this question of someone on my last podcast. My last podcast was with Michael Tolk, who is a somatic experiencing practitioner. And I just really would love to hear your own take, because you brought up the body and the connection between the body. A lot of people that work in trauma and a lot of people that work with IFS and somatics say trauma gets stuck in the body. I sit with that a lot and have my own take on it, but I would love to know your take on like that phrase, or how do you perceive that? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. Okay. I like that question. My take on it, I think, is, I did use the phrase stuck earlier, right? And like, that kind of does have a hopeless connotation, which I don't love. Trauma impacts our physical bodies. We know that's true. And I think our parts can like it can live there. Like it wants to be witnessed and seen. Like our parts, that's a huge thing, is like they want to be seen, they want to be validated. Our anxiety wants to be validated. I think our, like if we have chronic pain or something, it might want to be validated, right? It wants to make itself known. So I think on that level, yes, it lives in our body. And we can help like process it that way too, on that level. Like it's not just a cognitive level where it's helpful to process it. We have to do something with it somatically or energetically, I think, to help witness it and see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, what is trauma? I think it's Vessel van der Kolk that says one of his sayings is like, trauma is when you're not seen or not understood or not known, something like that.
Yeah.
And so part of trauma resolution or trauma integration is being seen and being understood and being known and allowing for that part of you that was hurt to be witnessed and just held in a safe space to be witnessed. And
Mm-hmm.
then so much can shift and integrate for the process.
I will say too, I think sometimes there's this almost like too far to the other end of the spectrum of like, if I get cancer, it's because I had too much negativity in my body, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
like things like that. And I am leery of that. Um, I think that's a manager part that wants control over things, right? Like if only I had done better, I had not, I think that's just a tricky balance. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Um,
I do.
it's hard, but there's also been studies that show like, women in chronic stress have higher levels of like fibromyalgia and things like that. So I don't know. It's just tricky. I don't want to see it go too far where like any health condition, we have to be like, well, it's my fault because I had too much stress. So
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the differentiation is how much blame are you trying to put on yourself? Is it being like your fault and like
yeah.
shaming yourself? And to me, there's the shame part and that's a firefighter coming out, or there's the part that's blaming you and it's trying to protect you and take control of
Mm-hmm.
an out of control situation in terms of health. And we do know, like you said, the higher rates of fibromyalgia, or that women are
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed with more chronic pain issues. And we look
Yeah.
at the history of women, and the myth
Mm-hmm.
of normal goes into all of this with Gabor Mate's book.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I'm with you. I'm like, yes, there's a mind, body, spirit connection. And we can't sit and blame ourselves for, I mean, some of it's genetic, some of it's epigenetic, some of it is just like, say what you will, like destiny and divinity of like, who knows? We have to be
Right.
okay sitting in that mystery of like, who knows? Yeah, I do. It is a very fine line to walk between I did this to myself versus
Mm-hmm.
this is out of my control.
Right.
Hmm. Yeah, Myth of Normal. I imagine that you read that book.
Yes, I have. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I loved that he is one of the first people because he has a big voice and he has a large platform and he's a
Mm-hmm.
physician, and so people are going to start listening to him. That he brings in the birth aspects and the postpartum aspects.
Yeah.
And as a counselor and as someone that works, or as an LCSW and someone that works with postpartum,
Mm-hmm.
like I'm so curious. Like a couple of things. Do you use internal family systems in your pregnancy and postpartum work?
Yes. I do, but not right at first, because when a lot of my pregnant or newly postpartum clients come in, there needs to be more like resource building, right? There needs to be some external and internal sense of like felt safety, because it's a wild world out there. We know like pregnancy and postpartum can be so rough. So I kind of, with the first few sessions, I usually It's how are you sleeping? How can we get you more sleep? Are you eating enough? What support do you have? Like, I do that with my therapy clients, which I think not in this population, that's really needed. And if someone were seeking therapy for something else, they maybe wouldn't do that, right? But in order to do any therapeutic work, we have to have that sense of like, I'm okay, my feet are on the ground. Which, when you're newly postpartum, you're not that way. so, so I, once they're kind of in that stable enough place, yeah, we definitely do go into parts work, and a lot of parts showing up for the first time uh, with our first pregnancy and postpartum, or with subsequent ones. But postpartum can kind of wake us up to ideas we had about motherhood or our own parenting that were kind of dormant for us. And then we're like, oh, why am I running up against this idea? I didn't think I held this belief, or things like that. So it's a really good, juicy time to explore a lot of that.
Yeah. And like you said, you come up against your own parenting and the parenting you may have received. And so a lot of inner child aspects can come up when people are new moms or new parents, because suddenly you're like, oh, I don't want to be the parent that that was my parent, or I don't want to do this, or I do want to do this aspect of parenting, but I can't because I don't have enough sleep. And so just all of it is so intense.
Yes. And I actually just finished reading Transformed by Birth, which I loved. Have you read that one?
No, I'm like, say more. I'm writing it down and I'll put it in the show
You should
notes.
read it. But she talks about how, like, from the Greek tradition, we live in a very Apollo world, like very ordered, like, you know, yin, structure, light, rules, like all that kind of stuff. Like, that's kind of our culture that we live in, right? And she opposes that with Artemis, who is like the goddess of, I don't know, the wilderness or something like that, I think. But just kind of the opposite of that. It's like the dark, the messy, um, the femininity, like kind of the opposite. And how when we give birth, we're used to living in this very Apollo world, but like labor postpartum throws us into this exact opposite. Like, no schedule, no structure, no time. You can't set your watch by what the infant will do, those types of things. And so I think those are, if we kind of use the lens of parts work to look at that, we're used to managers running the show. Like, most of us have at least one kind of lead manager that, it's not bad, but helps us get out of bed, go to our job. And like, we're used to that manager being in charge. But when we have a new infant, it's like that all goes out the window. And now we're like, well, the manager's not in charge. Who's in charge? What's going on? I can't, I got 3 hours of sleep last night. My body feels foreign to me. So it's just a way to kind of expand that metaphor of, it just, the world feels very out of balance, out of whack. And so it's discomforting to a lot of people to kind of shift from this Apollo to this Artemis type world, and knowing that our parts are going to respond differently when we make that shift.
Well, and I find too, like, there's so much there's collective pressure. Like, this is what it looks like to be a mom, and I need to have like the Instagram image of all of my children in their cute little outfits and shining, and we're all happy and everything's fine when everything's not fine. So I think there's that aspect to it. And then just like the demands of our current society, where it's like the mom does have to go back to work in 3 months. The dad gets 2 days off work to support his wife that might have just had a massive C-section. We don't live by our families, or our relationships with our parents aren't what we want them to be, or they can't support us because they're aging and they're dealing with their own medical issues. And there's just so much more isolation and so much more like just things to manage, like things to do. And it makes me think of a quote. I think this came from Rochelle Saliga, that said, like, I can be a mom just fine. Like, I love being a mom. I'm a great mom. what makes it hard is all the cultural aspects and the cultural expectations that I have to do on top of being mother mom. It's the laundry, it's the dishes, it's the cooking, it's the cleaning, it's the grocery shopping, it's the job. That's what makes my life hard.
Yeah. Yes.
Hmm.
So much to unpack there, right? I wish our culture were not that way and we were better at like appreciating what a monumental shift this is and how important it is to support new moms and families, and we don't really do it. I also like Julie Hanks, who talks about motherhood being a relationship and not a role, and how, like, yes, motherhood, the relationship can be great. Kind of like this quote was just saying, the relationship is great, but then like, is it, what's the role of being a mother? Is it doing laundry and grocery shopping? And like, how can we separate that? Because that's not really what a mother is, right? Like those are household management tasks that somehow got added on all mom's plate, right? But yeah. And the comparison. I'm often advising clients to not go on social media or just mute anyone for any reason at any time, even your best friend. If you have a comparison part come up, you just got to mute for a little while, and it's not a big deal. It's okay. You can unmute later, but we have to take care of ourselves, especially postpartum.
I love that reminder that the comparison aspect is just another part. It's another manager showing up, and it's okay to mute people for short periods of time and do what we need to do to take care of ourselves. And like you said, like, what do we need to do to resource ourselves, so that we're getting, I know breastfeeding and newborns, there's not a lot of sleep happening, but are there things you can do to capitalize on the times where you can sleep, or just how can we build support systems and different ways of being during that time period?
Yeah.
Do you find that the people that start to dive into this work prior to their postpartum, like either in conception or pregnancy, have a better postpartum?
Yes. I think having a therapist already like on deck, if you will, or like having done some therapeutic work is really helpful for the transition to pregnancy and postpartum, but especially IFS, and especially if you do end up struggling with a perinatal mental health disorder. And it's not just postpartum depression, right? It could be postpartum anxiety or postpartum OCD or postpartum PTSD, but just having that ability to separate, because especially postpartum, it feels like who we are a lot of times. Like, I feel depressed, I'm a bad mom, or it just feels so personal. And I think other times in our life, if we have a major life event and we're left feeling depressed or anxious, it might be easier to have that separation. But yeah, having a child is obviously, it is so personal, but it's harder for new moms to say, like, I'm experiencing postpartum anxiety. If they're not aware that's what could be going on, it could just be like, what's wrong with me? Like, I should be so happy I should be thrilled that I have a newborn right now and I don't feel great. I'm broken. So having IFS in your tool belt is super helpful to just kind of create that space, create that curiosity. That's one of the most, I think, helpful aspects of the capital S self is that curiosity. And can we take a step back and be curious? Okay, I haven't showered in 5 days. Can I approach that with curiosity instead of self-judgment? Or, whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big part of meditation and mindfulness as well, as that aspect to step into curiosity instead of judgment, and just like, can I just be curious about these things I'm feeling? Can I just be curious about these thoughts? And I know for me, like, if I don't have the capacity to be curious, then I'm not in a regulated nervous system state.
Yes.
I probably shouldn't be processing or doing anything other than trying to take care of myself and get back into a regulated state.
Definitely. Yeah. And reaching for curiosity is such a great tool I use with my clients all the time to try and create that shift. Because a lot of times it's the self-judgment that we're stuck in, like, well, why am I doing that? Why? Like, what's, we just have to take a step back and be like, okay, can I shift to curiosity? Can I be the observer here for a minute?
Mm. I love that redirection and that reframe of like, can I step into curiosity in this moment? That is a great tool. Yeah, I'm like letting that sink in. I'm like, wow, okay. um, when we chatted, you also had something else that you talked about that you do that I'd never heard before that you just lit up about when we were chatting, and that was the lifespan integration. And like you did, like your whole body language and your whole face just lit up. You were like, "Can I talk about this too?" And I was like, "Yes, please." So what is that?
Yes. Okay. I Not enough people know about this. Not enough therapists know about it. So, lifespan integration is a trauma healing modality where we create memory timelines with the client and read the client back the timeline. But we only use like 1 or 2 word cues for the client's memory. So it could just be like, you know, fourth grade is the clue, but the client has a very specific memory with that. So we're reading back the timeline to the client like pretty quickly, but it helps create new neural connections between all of these memories. And we talk, getting stuck or whatever in the past, but like kind of helps integrate lifespan integration. It helps integrate, create new neural pathways. And then we take the client right into the very present moment. So the last thing on the timeline is like you woke up this morning, you got dressed, and you're here with me in this appointment right now. So bringing us right into the present moment to be mindful. And I found this to be really helpful with birth story processing. A quote that I love by Kara Hopp, she said, most of us don't have we don't have like structures or systems in place to help us metabolize our births. Like we don't have that space, right? So this is one tool that I found helpful for clients just to process their birth story. We create a timeline of their memories of what happened, and I read it back to them. And clients will often have like new reflections on what happened. They'll have new insight into things, and it does integrate with IFS too, because a lot of times it's easier to look back and realize, okay, like I was in a manager part during that time. And then I know I shifted out of it down here when this memory happened, right? So I kind of use those both together. But it's just such a helpful tool for processing trauma, I think.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit about like, is that a therapy specific training, like to go learn that you have to be an LCSW or a therapist of some sort?
Yes, you do have to be a therapist in grad school, but you can't be in grad school, but working toward licensure or already licensed. Um, and kind of the hubs for it are actually in Salt Lake and then in the Northwest, like Portland area, and then in Europe. Like there's a lot of therapists in France that are using it. So it's becoming a lot more popular and more kind of more well known.
Okay. And is that how IFS? I know there's a waiting list to like be IFS certified. And
Yes.
what is that process? So if people are looking for someone to do IFS therapy, what would they look for, or what's important to know about seeking that out?
Yes. IFS certification is unfortunately really long and hard to get into. They actually have a lottery for the IFS trainings. I have been unsuccessful in winning the lottery. So I'm IFS informed is the language that we use when I've done some training, but not the official, like they have different levels of IFS training. So keep your fingers crossed for me that I will be able to do that training. Lifespan integration, though, is a much more accessible training for people that want another trauma modality to use if they are a practitioner. So,
Yeah, that's so great. And people that aren't therapists can also become IFS
informed or
yes.
correct.
And even they hold trainings specific for like coaches or for other like practitioners of different types to use IFS too. So
That's what I thought. And like, as I was telling you on the call, I just found myself naturally doing some parts work with myself or with my inner child healing or with clients when it would come up. And then I realized, like, oh, this is actually a thing
mm-hmm.
that you can go specifically learn. And just to mention, Richard Schwartz was the main guy that kind of came up with this. And he came up with it years ago. I heard him on another podcast. And he's like, I put this out there years ago and now it's finally now there's finally a steam for it. He's like, I don't know what happened in the last 5 years.
Yeah, I don't know either, but
I love that because I'm like, okay, we don't know what we're creating now we think might not be helpful or we think might not be successful. And he's been waiting years for this to catch steam, and it finally has, which is really interesting. There was a shift in the paradigm that now people are super into it.
Yeah.
Wild. Well, do you work specifically with pre and perinatal, or do you see other areas and other clients as well?
I do see other clients as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm curious. I feel like I've answered all my questions in relationship to IFS. I always forget the name of the other one. I have to keep looking it up. The lifespan integration.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you want to share? It could be IFS, it could be trauma training, it could be pre and perinatal, it could be on your own life.
I think I just want to, I always am trying to spread the word about self-compassion. And I think if, for someone listening to this might be like, I don't know, parts where that maybe it seems out of reach, but like starting with self-compassion, like starting with, can I just change my inner monologue just a little bit today? Or like about a certain event, can I speak to myself more kindly about it? It can have just such a huge impact. So I think that's really foundational to my practice. No matter what modality I'm using, is the work of self-compassion. And I know for myself, like I had my own postpartum experiences, and having that in my tool belt was really helpful. I was still surprised, like the amount of shame I felt at times. After my third child, I had some like postpartum anxiety, had a panic attack, had some intrusive thoughts, and just like I knew exactly what was going on for me. But part of me was like, oh, but we don't want to tell anyone about this. I had this part come up that was like, no, we're going to pretend that everything's fine. So having this like compassion work, this parts work was really helpful to say like, okay, this is okay. I can use the knowledge that I have to actually be kind to myself. And had to practice I like to put my hand on my heart sometimes and say like, okay, this is a hard moment for you. I see that you're struggling, but it's going to be okay. So I guess just leaving that with self-compassion work and how powerful it can be.
I love that. Thank you. It did make me think of another question though, around anxiety showing up more with your third. Was anything different with that pregnancy, or is that just a coincidence?
It was mostly just a coincidence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is another educational piece that I wish we all knew more about, is that there are certain like predispositions that make us more vulnerable, but it can show up with your third or your fifth, even if it hasn't shown up, even if you hadn't had other mental health issues with previous pregnancies or postpartum. So yeah.
And finding that postpartum anxiety is so common and getting more and more common. And I know there's a lot of focus on postpartum depression, and just want to put out there to listeners for themselves or for their family members of like listening to those, those stories coming up with your family members or your wife or your partners of like those pieces of anxiety coming in, because that is happening more and more.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, that anxiety piece can be particularly hard to like see if we're not looking for it. Because the new mom on the outside might look great. She might look put together. She might be cooking beautiful meals still, and all the kids are perfectly scrubbed down and lined up and beautiful. But like inside, she might be having terrible anxiety. So yeah, really kind of being on the lookout for the sneaky signs of anxiety and irritability, which can go in there, and rage. Again, really hard to separate from those. They feel like who we are, but they're symptoms. So,
Yeah. I'll just plug this now because you brought it up. And it came up. I was speaking to a doula that was sharing her own experience of her own birth that had some rage come up. And we were actually talking polyvagal theory at the time and nervous system stuff and totally geeking out. And and she was sharing her experience about rage. And then the next day I was in Facebook and someone brought up, I have rage now in my postpartum. And, I kind of commented, but I think people are like, whatever, Lesha, this nervous system nerd. I was like, yay, you have rage. It means that you're coming out of freeze. Like, good for you. And you just need a safe space to have your rage and to facilitate it and move it through your body. And so I just want to put that plug of like, rage is also a very normal nervous system thing. Nothing is wrong with anyone that's experiencing rage. And it's actually a beautiful sign of coming out of freeze, which happens a lot in birth trauma. So finding people that understand that and can work with you with that to move through the rage so it doesn't keep getting suppressed, because people will be like, well, I can't feel rage. This isn't safe. So I'm just going to keep suppressing it. Yeah. And then that just keeps putting the person back into freeze and back in that nervous system state. So just plugging that rage is normal, especially in postpartum, and finding
like sometimes it's like the most appropriate response to giving birth in a patriarchal culture. And it definitely, we need to honor that rage and witness it and let it out. I'm with you. So
yeah, so it's normal if you're listening and you're experiencing that, or you're like, oh, that was my second birth. Like, the more for me, we can just have these normal conversations and talk about these different things and let people know, like, yeah, rage, anxiety, depression, shame, like all of these things are totally normal and should not be shamed more. Like, let's talk about these things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know that you're local. Are you, and with like licensure laws, you're probably not able to see people out of state, or are you able to see people outside of Utah?
No, I can't. I can only see people in Utah. For anyone that is local, I'm in Lehi. And I own a group practice, so I have a few other therapists working for me. And we actually just moved into the cutest little old house as our office. Cool. So we have some more space, and I'm hoping to facilitate some new groups and things like that coming up. So, yep.
That's exciting. Well, I'll put all of your contact information in the show notes so that if people are local, they can keep an eye on you through Instagram. They can reach out to you. They can go to your website, especially if they're interested in working with you or any of the therapists in your office or any future groups, or just want to reach out to you and be like, yes, hey, I heard that podcast and I have a question.
Please reach out.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me today, Laura.
Thank you.